All right, got that going just as, oh, I didn't fall asleep. I was just blocking it with my body. All right. Let's do a quick recap from of the philosophers that we've already been talking about before we jump into the Sophists. So, quick recap to just warm up our brains. Remind ourselves, what was Thales?
The one stuff.
The one stuff. He's the one that's first asking the questions of philosophy. He thinks everything in the universe ultimately has to be composed of one stuff. What is that one stuff? He's now asking those questions. So he's the father of philosophy, father of science, and in a sense, and father of mathematics. So he's the one that kicks off this whole new way of learning about the world around us. Starts with Thales. And then we get to Pythagoras. And what's Pythagoras?
The numbers.
Numbers. The one stuff is numbers, and everything's composed of numbers. And while that doesn't sound very good, he's the first one that starts thinking that somehow mathematics has to describe this universe around us. It has to be able to be used to describe reality, which very much catches on later. And now if you go take a modern physics course, you're going to be studying a bunch of mathematics. It's what we use to describe reality. So that's the influence of him. Heraclitus.
He was dealing with change.
Change.
I think
We got a quote with his that
he rejected logic, didn't he?
he rejects logic. Implicitly, the laws of logic were stated.
Everything is becoming.
Nothing is, everything is becoming. Nothing exists.
Right.
There are no entities in this universe. Nothing is. Everything that exists is just becoming. Not being, not non-being, becoming. Change. Everything's just change. Very hard to wrap our heads around that kind of philosophy. Very strange philosophy. And now, the great contester of Heraclitus, Parmenides. And what's Parmenides?
He rejected logic, or he rejected change and accepted logic.
He rejects change, accepts logic. These two both agree that change implies a contradiction. He says, great, there's change, so logic doesn't work. He says, no, there's logic, so change doesn't work. And so from there on out, the philosophers that we had that come after him are trying to come up with a way to reconcile these two worldviews. They want their universe with change and with logic. They want the two together. And so we saw some people's attempts to do that. Empedocles was the first one with his 4 elements, and Anaxagoras with his seeds. More famous, though, are the atomists, in particular, Democritus. And what's he famous for?
With the atoms and the hooks and stuff like that.
Atoms and what?
With the different shapes of atoms.
So there's atoms and the void. Atoms and the void. Nothingness, it actually exists. There's being and non-being co-acting together, and being behaves the way that Parmenides describes, but there's also non-being. And he thinks that he got around it with that way. But so you got atoms in the void with Democritus. And he's also the one that starts the assault on qualitative properties. Qualitative properties aren't real. They only exist in your mind. All that really exists out there are atoms in the void. Your senses, they deceive you when they tell you that there's all these qualities out there in reality. No. There's only atoms in the void with the properties of atoms. And what were the properties? Size, position, and motion. Size, shape, and motion.
And weight.
And maybe weight. So back and forth on that one. Okay, so that's a quick recap. So now we're going to move to our next group of philosophers, which are going to be called the Sophists. We're only going to cover 4 of them. There are a bunch of Sophists. We're only going to cover these 4. Protagoras, he's going to be the first one to actually call himself a Sophist. And then the fact that we chose these 3, Gorgias, he's pretty standard covered. The fact that we chose these 2, there's a lot of others we could have plugged in here. It's somewhat arbitrary what my choice is. So we'll be starting, though, with Protagoras. Now, before we jump into the Sophists, we need to set the scene in Athens, at least, or not in Athens, but in Greece, that these Sophists are coming into. So right now, what's happening in Greece? What's happening is the Greeks are winning the Greco-Persian Wars. They just beat Persia, they drove them out, defeated their army, defeated their fleet. Greece is on the rise. And in particular, Athens is on the rise. Remember, Athens starts the Delian League, and Sparta dropped out of the conflict. Athens is the one now going around liberating city after city. And the cities that get liberated, they join Athens' Delian League, which means that they have to do one of 2 things. They have to either contribute ships to Athens' military to help them continue in the war effort, or they have to contribute money. Practically speaking, none of them really have fleets, and so they're all contributing money. And so tons of wealth is just pouring into Athens at this time. Athens is becoming very wealthy. So you got Athens becoming very wealthy. That's one important key. The other thing, what kind of government does Athens have?
Democracy.
A democracy. And so as Athens is liberating these city-states, democracy is spreading like crazy. So democracy is spreading like a wildfire. And so this is going to help set the scenes for the Sophists. So let's think about actually being inside of one of these city-states for a second with a democracy for our government. So when we say they have a democracy, we don't mean a democracy like we have in the United States today. We have a democratic republic. You don't vote on a piece of legislation to see if you like it or not. You don't suggest some law. You vote for someone who's supposed to represent your interests. And it's not some majority vote as to whether or not we accept a law or not. It's some people that represent you. The democracies that we're talking about here in Greece are pure democracies. You actually can go sit in the assembly. You can present the legislation that you think should be a law, and people vote on it. You get a vote on the laws that are suggested to you. If there's a court going on, you go and you sit, and you judge the person who presents their case. If you're accused of a crime, and you have to go to court, you have to present yourself. You can't hire a lawyer to come and talk for you. You present yourself to the assembly. And if the assembly finds you guilty, you're guilty. Doesn't really matter what the law says. You have to convince the assembly to vote you guilty, or convince them not to vote you guilty. And so it's all a matter of persuasion. And so this is how you get political power in these democracies. You have to be able to persuade the mass, the assembly. You got to be able to get them on your side. Now, let's imagine two types of people. There's the son of a wealthy man who's able to dedicate his life to leisure and studying rhetoric, how to persuade people. And then there's another man who's the son of a shoe cobbler. If they both end up in court together, who has the advantage? The wealthy man who is able to study rhetoric. Now, furthermore, imagine that there's these people called Sophists who are going to be able to teach you how to master rhetoric. So now those people exist. How many people want to be masters of rhetoric in democracies? A lot of people. So there's going to be a few Sophists, which are seen as great teachers of rhetoric, and there's going to be a lot of people demanding their skills. When there's small supply and massive demand, what do? Jack up the prices. And so who can afford the Sophists? The son of the rich man can afford the Sophists. So he already had an advantage out the gate, and on top of that, he's hiring the Sophists to make him even more proficient in this skill. And so how are you, the common man, going to view the Sophists? Enemy. Not in a very positive light. So we're going to see early on that these Sophists, they have a bad reputation in Greece. The Greeks don't like it. So now, from the Sophist perspective, what are they doing? They see that what they're offering is a very practical skill. They think that you should dedicate your life to studying these practical things. They think it's good for a man to learn how to become influential in his city and so study rhetoric. They're trying to be very practically minded people and teach you skills that they think you would want to learn. So they travel around Greece trying to go gather up the sons of young men who want to teach from them and collect their money and get paid to teach. And so these Sophists in general, they have these great reputations for being wise. They're teaching rhetoric, and they're collecting good money, collecting a bunch of wealthy students. And that's kind of the scene that we got going on with these Sophists. Any questions on that? Just want to give a really high-level view before we dive into whatever I have here.
What exactly is a sophist?
Sophist. So the etymology on it just tells us a wise man. Sophia is wisdom. You had philosophy, the love of wisdom. So that's the etymology on the word philosophy. Same with on the Sophists. So the Sophists here, they're not a school the same way that we had the Milesian school, all following the same ideas. They're instead a professional class. Following the etymology, a Sophist, just a wise man. That's just what it means. Now, at this time, many city-states in Greece were becoming more democratic, and so people's political power was often related to their ability to persuade the assembly or the masses. It's often how you also got your position. Oftentimes when Greece is deciding, Athens is deciding who's going to be a general, someone suggests themselves, and they just give some really persuasive argument. When we get to the Peloponnesian Wars, we're going to hear about this guy Alcibiades, just a super charismatic guy who just finds his way into power everywhere he goes. And it's just his ability to persuade people to just listen to him. It's amazing. So, yeah, at this time, city-states were becoming more democratic, and so people's political power was often related to their ability to persuade the assembly or the masses. It was also commonly the case that the person would represent themselves in court when charges were brought against them, and so here again, the art of persuasion was extremely useful. The Sophists traveled around Greece, offering to teach men this art for a fee. many of them accumulating a vast amount of wealth. Hopefully with how we set the scene, all that makes sense. What the? Okay. Now, those city-states were becoming democratic. The old aristocratic families still possess the majority of the wealth. So that's why I was explaining early on. When government suddenly decides it's going to be a democracy, there's not like some mass redistribution of wealth. And so there's still those who were in power beforehand have all the wealth, and those who don't have power, or those who didn't have power, don't have the wealth. And those who had power beforehand, and now the democracy's here, they pretty much are still able to maintain power. Because they're able to hire the professionals in persuasion, and they're able to be more persuasive.
You have representatives, like, for instance, represent you in court.
No.
represent you in-
A common thing, though, is you could hire someone to write your speech for you. But then again, who do you want to write your speech for you? Someone who's really good at it, like a sophist. You can't afford their fee. So some wealthy people would hire sophists to write their fees, but in general, most people just want the sophist to train them. So that they could just have the skill in general, rather than just getting one speech out of them. And that's often one of the ways that the sophists would train their students, is just give them a bunch of speeches to memorize. And you would wait for the context that that speech would come up, and then you could just give this speech that you had just rehearsed so many times. You had practiced all the inflections, all the hand gestures, everything that you could have done. So that you just give it and persuade people. So that was a big part of their actual training. So we've got the wealthy class. The aristocracy in the previous government becomes a wealthy class in the next government, and still, for all practical purposes, maintains the political power. So it's often the case that only the sons of well-to-do families would receive instruction from the sophists. In the internal struggle between the many and the aristocracy, the sophists were seen as firmly on the side of the aristocracy. And this was a common theme in Greek city-states, that you'd have this contest basically between the aristocracy and the many, and one overthrowing the others and the others overthrowing the one. A common example was the city of Miletus. It went through tons of revolutions over this time. The wealthy coming into control over the city, killing all their political rivals, and then the masses overcoming them, often by appointing a dictator, and then killing all the rivals, and the dictator seizing the wealth from the aristocracy. And the cycle goes on. Anyways, so the sophists are seen on the side of the aristocracy. This produced a reputation for them similar to a modern's view of a corporate lawyer. That's the analogy often given. How a typical person views a corporate lawyer is kind of how a standard Greek would have viewed a sophist. Hence, the sophists obtained a bad name, leading to the negative connotation the word has today. Usually that Sophi root in English words has negative connotation. Sophistry, what does that mean? Subtly deceptive reasoning or argumentation. Because again, in one way it's negative connotation, but in another sense, this is a lot what they did. They weren't teaching you how to reason, they were teaching you how to persuade. Very different things. And we'll get a sense of that here. Okay, now before we dive into them, since they're going to be our first skeptics, we need to talk about 4 very important words and make sure that they're very clear. Those 4 words are objective versus subjective, and absolute versus relative. It has to be very clear in our head exactly what these 4 words mean, because they don't go away in philosophy. So, what does it mean for something to be objective? It means it's an object. It exists independent of you. Its existence is in no way dependent upon you. This is an object. It has objective existence. It is no way dependent upon me for its existence. I have a toothache. That is completely subjective. If you get rid of me, you get rid of my toothache. I'm experiencing seeing light. That's a completely subjective experience. That exists only for me. You can't have that experience. You can come next to me and see similar light, but you can't see the same light that I see. The same way that I can have my tooth pain, you can have your tooth pain, but I can never feel your pain, you can never feel my pain. Your emotions are completely subjective. There's no way for me to experience your emotions. If we get rid of you, those emotions cease to exist. More obvious example, a hallucination is subjective. If you're hallucinating that there's another container right here, that's completely dependent on you for its existence. If I get rid of you, that container's gone. It was dependent on you completely for its existence. Objective versus subjective. Any questions on those 2? Okay, next 2. Absolute versus relative. I think this one's easier to understand if we start with relative. What does it mean for something to be relative?
Based off of something else.
Right, it has to be relative to something else. So, give you an easy one. Am I tall? Well, I'm taller than some, shorter than others. He's back there shaking his head. Because he's a lot taller than I am. Am I tall or am I short? Well, it's relative. Relative to what? I'm taller than some things and shorter than other things. Now, on the other hand, I'm 5'10", that's absolute. Or 5'9", that's absolute.
Sounds like objective properties are absolute, and then subjective properties are relative.
Natural connection, but no. And make sure that's completely clear by the time we finish up here. Okay. Let me give you another thing that's relative. Position. Where am I right now?
In front of me.
In front of you? Well, if you're going to know where I am, we now have to know where James is first. And you say, okay, we'll be clever with it. How about you give my longitude, my latitude, and my altitude? Well, that just tells where I am relative to the center of the Earth. Imagine that I had some magical wormhole right here that I could talk through. And some alien somewhere else in the universe had the other end of it. And I'm trying to tell them where I am. I tell them I'm on Earth. They say, where's Earth? I say, well, it's the third planet traveling around the sun. They say, what's the sun? I say, well, it's da-da-da-da-da in the Milky Way galaxy. They say, what's the Milky Way galaxy? I say, well, you look at this cluster of galaxies, it's the one right here. They say, what's that cluster of galaxies? For all I know, they can't even see it in their night sky. How do I tell them where I am? Position is relative. Position is absolute. Position is objective, but it's relative. We can all agree that relative to that point in this room, I am 1 meter this way and 4 meters this way, or whatever it is. So objective, yet relative. Another one that's relative, velocity. Imagine that you and I were out floating in space. Completely dark place in space. Can't see any stars around us. And all I know is that from my perspective, you're drifting that way. And in your perspective, I'm drifting that way. Who's really moving? Is it you're moving, or is it I'm moving? Velocity is relative. You're moving right, relative to me. I'm moving left, relative to you. Now, it's still objective. We can measure exactly the speed that you're moving away from me and that I'm moving away from you. So still objective, but relative. Relative in physics, we often say it's what depends upon your reference frame. You need a reference frame to talk about it. What's absolute? So you're looking for something that's objective and absolute. These would be like the laws of physics. Regardless of your reference frame, regardless of where you are, this is how the laws of physics behave. So no matter where you go stand on the Earth, you're feeling the exact gravitational force between you and the Earth that you're feeling. It's in no way dependent upon your reference frame. That's objective and absolute. So that's those 4 words. Any questions on those 4 words? Okay. So now, our sophists are going to be our first avowed skeptics. What is skepticism? It is a theory that there is no certain here meaning objective and absolute. The theory that there is no certain knowledge, the theory that certain knowledge is impossible. It's impossible to get any objective, absolute knowledge. Chances are you view the Pythagorean theorem as objective and absolute knowledge. The sophists say no, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as objective and absolute knowledge. All knowledge is subjective and relative. That's a skeptic position. And the sophists are going to be the first ones to introduce this in a formal way. Good? Okay. So, sophists are the first avowed skeptics. Their main argument against knowledge consists in 2 premises. First, that the sense perceptions are the ultimate root of all knowledge. Ultimately, everything you come to know comes through your sense perceptions. That's their first basic premise. Everything you know ultimately had to come through your sense perceptions. No way around it. Is there anything you know that didn't come through your sense perception? I mean, even think about your basic words. First time you learned the word dog, how did that work? You pointed, and your parents said, dog, and you said dog. And then you pointed at cat, and you said dog, and they said no, cat. And you start learning these basic words, these basic concepts. came from all your sense perceptions. So all knowledge comes from sense perceptions. That's number one. It's the root of all knowledge. And second, that all our sense perceptions are flawed. They can't perfectly communicate reality to you. That's our two basic premises. So let's dive more into that. When we perceive, what we perceive depends upon the object itself being perceived. If I see that phone, it depends upon the actual phone. What I see depends on the actual state of the phone. So when we perceive, what we perceive depends upon the objects being perceived and the nature of our sensory apparatus. You and the colorblind man looking at a red rose see very different things. Because your sensory apparatus is very different even when you're looking at the exact same object of sight. One of you sees a red, the other of you sees a gray. So each person has their own particular perceptions. Now, we cannot go by the majority rule in deciding who is actually right. What are we going to do? Is a rose actually red or is it gray? We're going to take a population count, see what the majority of people think. If you live in a city where the majority of people are colorblind, are we going to all agree that the rose is gray? Let's make it more absurd. Imagine that you live amongst a population of people who are all cross-eyed. And you say there's 100 people in this town, and they say, no, there's not, there's 200. 99 of us think one thing, although they'll say 198 of us. And it's just little one or two of you who says otherwise. How can you come to agree on anything? So you're going to disagree if you have different sense perceptions, so you're naturally going to disagree with each other. How can you work out this disagreement? They say there is no way to work it out. So nobody knows the truth about reality, since nobody can perceive reality except as processed by their particular sensory apparatus. And thus, everyone's apparatus affects their perceptual experience. I can't perceive with your apparatus, you can't perceive with mine. We each only have our own sensory apparatus. And so we can never for sure know the same things. All we can ever know is the way reality appears to us. And it's even worse than that, because your sensory apparatus could change. So all we can ever know is the way reality appears to us now, because it could change down the road. Thus, we can make no objective claims. Also, since our apparatus is subject to change, the way reality appears to us now isn't the way it will necessarily appear to us later. Thus, we can't make any absolute claims. So nothing's absolutely the case, since it can change with time. And nothing's objectively the case, since no two people can agree. Remember, the way that we know that this is an object is all of us can agree. If multiple people can observe it, it's objective. So here's how they're arguing against there being anything objective. All we can know is the way reality appears to us. So I can't know the way it appears to you. And I can't know you're actually seeing the same thing. So I can't say that that's an object, or that has objective existence. And since it can change with time, it can't be absolute. So they argue against the objective, and they argue against the absolute. These are their high-level arguments. We haven't gotten into any particular sophists. I probably should have said something about that. Since we can't cover all the sophists, what I'm doing is I'm trying to give you a general approach to their arguments, and then we'll go through the specific four that I have. Should have said that better. Okay, other arguments that they had. So while sophists rejected the validity of the senses, they are not rationalists. They are still empiricists. Remember, rationalists would be like Parmenides. I don't care what my senses say. Logic, reason tells me that there's just this big solid ball of being. So that's reality. And they ignore the senses altogether. So the sophists, they say all knowledge has to come through the senses. So they're empiricists. All knowledge has to come through the senses. But our senses are faulty. And so you can't trust any of the knowledge that comes through senses. All knowledge comes through the senses, but you can't trust anything the senses tell you. So all knowledge is unknowable. So they still claim that reason is fundamentally dependent upon the evidence of the senses, and that all knowledge is based in the senses. Since we cannot depend upon the senses, we are also unable to depend upon the conclusions of reason. So basically, the premises your reason needed to start with has to come from the senses. Since you can't get good premises, the conclusion of reason, no, they're out. So you can't reason your way to conclusions because you can't get your starting data to begin with. Second common argument. A second argument against possibility of knowledge was based in the idea that for every proposition, convincing arguments can be constructed both for and against the proposition. This is something that the sophists were famous for. They would say, you give me the topic, you give them the topic. And they say, okay, which side of the issue do you want me to argue? And they'd argue any side that you wanted. And they trained their students to do that. And why would they train their students to do that? Because who cares what's true or false? All that matters is what side do you need to convince the mob of, and here's how you do it. So, a second argument against the possibility of knowledge was basically the idea that for every proposition, convincing arguments can be constructed on both for and against proposition. Sophists would often display their skill by allowing their listeners to both propose a topic of discussion, along with which side they should argue. Good way to hone their skills. They can argue anything. Now, their ethics. So, what is the ethics of the Sophists going to be? Well, since Sophists are agnostic, remember, they're not atheists. They're not saying that there's no God, but they're also not saying that there is a God. They're saying it's unknowable. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But since they're agnostic, they cannot base their ethics in religion. You can't say it's God-given to us. You can't say it's from some religion. How do you argue your basics for ethics? So, religion then. And since they claim reason is deficient, they can't base it in reason. So what do you base your system of ethics in? How do you determine how someone ought to behave? Therefore, there is no objective ethics. Virtue is not based on objective human nature, but rather it's a result of arbitrary social conventions. Since good only expresses a preference or desire, then what feels good to you now is good for you now. Right? What else can you go on? All you basically have is your sense perceptions. All you know is that some things produce pleasure, some things produce pain. You can't rely on your reason to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. You can't rely on some religion, some tradition. All that's out. So what do you rely on? Your sense perceptions. And whatever seems good to you now, produces pleasure for you now, is good for you now. And whatever seems to produce pain for you now, seems to be undesirable now, is bad for you now. And that's all there is to it. All desires are ethically equal. How else would you say one desire is better than another? So all desires are ethically equal because there's no objective metric to go by. So you got a strong desire to eat an ice cream cone? Go eat an ice cream cone. You got a strong desire to murder a bunch of little puppies? Go murder a bunch of little puppies. It's all ethically equal. You got the desire, go satisfy it. That's all there is to life. Now you can run into a little bit of a problem. What happens when there's only one ice cream cone and we both want it? How do you and I come to terms about who should get it? We can't reason our way to do it. We can't fall back on some religion. Force. Whichever one of us can assert ourselves the most is the one who gets the ice cream cone. And so they're the first ones that's going to put forth the argument, might makes right.
What about, like, foresight, like, don't eat the one marshmallow right now so you can have 3 later or something. Like the investment.
Right. And you're thinking about that, there's going to be this later. How do you know that there's going to be a later?
Well,
How do you know that there's a marshmallow now?
Yes, I'm curious if they address that specific.
No. They say, in that moment, do whatever seems advantageous to you now. Take the marshmallow now. Maybe you'll be able to steal another one later. So,
back to being an animal. Seems funny.
exactly. It's back to just pleasure and pain. Satisfy pleasure, avoid pain. Now they say, we come and we make these rules of agreement with you. Why don't I kill you to get your ice cream cone? While that would make my life better, it might cause someone else to kill me to get my ice cream cone. So we're going to make an agreement. I'm going to sacrifice a perfect life of killing you. In exchange, you're going to sacrifice a perfect life of killing me. And that's the type of agreement that we're going to have, and that's how they think law is coming to being. Thrasymachus says we're all just a bunch of cowards. We're just afraid of someone else killing us. And that's the reason that we do these laws. But if we could get away with it, we'd really go around stealing everyone's ice cream. So they think that the best life is to be in a state of constantly desiring and satisfying those desires, right? That ultimate pleasure of having that strong desire and satisfying that desire, the ultimate pleasure. That's the perfect life. To be always thirsting and drinking, or hungering and eating. One of them, they talk about how they want to have a really long neck. That's the ideal life. So that you can taste that food longer as it goes down your throat. The perfect life. To be in a state of constantly satisfying your desires. So that was an overarching view of the Sophists and what they thought. Now we're going to come down on just the first one, Protagoras. Now, understand that not all the Sophists are the same. I'm kind of creating this box of generalities, so not everyone perfectly fits into that box. And it's just, if you take a collage of all their different influences, that box I created is kind of the box that comes out.